I just wanted to thank everybody again for taking the day or day and a half and all the time you might have spent on Zoom during the virtual portion of this conference to join us in this conversation. I want to take a few moments just to thank a few people that many of you maybe have seen, but maybe you haven't seen, but have made everything happen over the course of the last week. So first off, I want to thank Brendan McConville, Mary Beth Norton, Barbara Oberg, Scott Stevenson, and Serena Zabin for serving on the program committee and really taking so much time in the last year on meetings, on email, reviewing proposals, thinking of people to invite to really bring together and put together this panel, this wide-ranging discussion that has lasted all week and really has been focused in person here in the last day and a half. I want to thank the members of the American Philosophical Society who have taken their time to attend. Linda Greenhouse, who I know you all, many of you have seen and interacted with. Leslie Aiello, who's on the Library and Museum Committee. Elizabeth Cropper, who's also on the Library and Museum Committee and is Vice President of the Society. Charles Dempsey, Barbara Oberg, the Chair of the Library and Museum Committee, and Jack Rakov for coming and joining us in the conversation as well. I want to thank the David Center Steering Committee, which is composed of Annette Gordon-Reed, Jack Rakov, Woody Holton, Patrick Griffin, Catherine Grandjean, who's been with us, Scott Stevenson, Jeffrey Rosen at the National Constitution Center, and Brendan McConville for providing the guidance and the vision for the David Center that's brought us to this point, is going to bring us forward as well. The members of the David Library Board, who Linda Greenhouse acknowledged last night, and Jim Links, who's with us right now, Yvette Taylor, who's also with us, Brendan McConville, Francine Stone, who I know is attending online and has been engaging with us via email, Tina Packer, and Norval Reese, who were not able to attend, but I know are very interested to hear how everything went. And then finally, but most importantly, the members of the APS staff who have been working tirelessly to manage the virtual portion and also all the logistics that go into an in-person conference, which we'd all forgotten about after 2 years. You know, we had it ran smoothly, but we did have to remind ourselves how we did things before and how we have to change also in light of everything that's happened in the last 2 years. So I want to thank Adriana Link, who just has been, central in so many ways, most recently as being that disembodied voice of the internet. Kyle Roberts, who was also part of the program committee and has helped in so many different ways. Maggie Hoot, who I know many of you have exchanged emails with. Brenna Holland, assistant to the librarian. Jessica Frankenfield, our communications associate. Jeremy Schronrock and Todd Schronrock, who are the AV masters who have made everything work here and online, and Donna Stum and the rest of the members of the facilities who have made all this possible. So thank you all for everything you've done. So I keep getting asked, sorry about that. I keep getting asked, how do you think things are going? Is this what you wanted? You know, and people have been asking me, what was the outcome of this supposed to be? You know, what's going to follow this? You know, and I think one of the things we talked about is that it's kind of, you know, we're in this, people always talk about, you know, how do you measure success? What's the metrics and all this? And there's a point to some of that, but for this, we really thought more about the intangible, that we just wanted to bring people together to start conversations that might spark ideas, build a forum for people to build connections, reestablish connections that maybe have been lost by the pandemic, and just see what might happen over the course of the next 5 years. We know there's a lot of organizations, the APS among them, who are going to be doing a lot of things in the course of the next 5 years, and we just hope that maybe this gathering might have some influence in all that to come. And really, it really was about talking about ideas, sparking ideas, starting conversations. And I can't imagine a better way to end today by the conversation we're about to have now, which we hope will just reverberate in the days, weeks, and years to come. So to have this conversation, moderating it is Serena Zabin, who is a professor of history and the Broom Fellow for Public Scholarship and chair of the history department at Carleton. I didn't realize you were the chair too. Wow. Thank you for also being on the program committee. She's the author of a number of books, Dangerous Economy, Status and Commerce in Imperial New York, The New York Conspiracy Trials of 1741, Daniel Horsmanden's Journal of the Proceedings, as well as the prize-winning book that I'm sure many of us have read, and that she just gave a public talk at the APS for, The Boston Massacre, A Family History, which came out in 2020 and was named an Amazon Editor's Choice for History. And she's going to be moderating a conversation between two people that don't really need introductions. And, you know, when you get these introductions, they can be so long, and we'd end up taking all 45 minutes. So we have Alan Taylor, who has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. And we have Mary Beth Norton, whose path-breaking work on women, law, politics, loyalism, and most recently, the winner of the George Washington Prize for her book on 1774. If you want to read more, you can see their web pages, but I'll leave it there so we can have the conversation. I'm sorry. I acknowledged all the APS members. They're also APS members. I should have mentioned that too.
So I think I just want to start by echoing Pat's appreciation for everything that went into this, but most of all to all of you for this togetherness. It has indeed been exciting and generative, I think. And so that's what we want to try to talk about today. I want to sort of pull together a few of the themes that I've heard over this last week and turn them into a couple of questions, maybe 3, and then open it to all of you. So I want to start by saying that the scholarship that we have heard and learned over this week has been spectacular. I learned so much. It's been so exciting. It's been so thoughtful and so nuanced and complicated, right? And we've been hearing about how difficult it is to tell complicated stories. So I think the first place maybe we should start is this question about, well, of all of this scholarship, which themes, which parts of it should we think about bringing forward as we talk about 2026? In the last panel, people pointed out that 1976 also was a pretty generative moment for some of the scholarship. It was, yes, a moment of, you know, some maybe somewhat embarrassing, I don't know, what's the word we want to say? Uncritical, patriotic love and a lot of tri-cornered hats, right? Maybe that's not the place we really want to go. And maybe this is the place to fess up that I grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, and experiencing that as a child in 1776 is its own trauma that I won't go back to. But here I am. So I'd love for us to maybe think together a little bit, you know, how, what pieces should we think about prioritizing as we bring them forward? How do we tell these stories? Especially, I think, I was really struck, I mean, I would love to call out every single paper I heard. I learned so much from all of you, but I'm gonna pull out just one theme, and those of you who fit in it probably can hear yourselves here, which are about these larger contexts, right? The age of Constitution writing, right? This kind of large world of slave code production, right? The enormous geographical range in which 1776 needs to be considered. So how do we include these insights? Which pieces should we bring, and how do we do that? Mary Beth.
Okay, I will start, and I want to start with 2 anecdotes about 1976, when I was not a child. I was already teaching, and but the first thing that happened, I don't remember when my second visit to Yorktown was, but my first visit to Yorktown, this is for the National Park Service people, my first visit to Yorktown was sometime before the Revolution bicentennial. And I was already very familiar with Yorktown as being the important battle of the American Revolution. And I was surprised. This is one of my first moments of historical sensibility, that when I went to Yorktown battlefield, what battles were were shown, it was the battles of the Civil War in Yorktown. It was not the Yorktown battlefield that we're now familiar with, which was done post-1976. And in fact, now if you go to Yorktown, the Civil War battlements are really, they're there, but they're not emphasized. So one thing that happened was the reinterpretation of the Yorktown battlefield in 1976. Second thing that happened in 1976 to me personally was it became known in the field that I was working on a book on women in the Revolution, which no one else was working on at the time. And so I proceeded to be invited to give lectures at, you cannot imagine how many universities all over the country. In fact, so many that I became physically ill as a result and ended up in the hospital after one very frantic trip, and almost missed my opportunity of speaking at West Point. They decided to prepare for the admission of women for the next year in West Point by having me be a major speaker there. And I literally got out of my sick bed because I was not going to miss that opportunity. And anyway, so that will not happen now. This is a big difference between 1976 and 2026 and what is coming in 2076. There are many more people working on not only the kinds of topics that I was working on in 1976, but also more to come. So that's basically the point of that observation, of that anecdote. I want to pick up on what Serena talked about the broad context, because I think that's one of the things that I also got out of all the presentations. And the broad contexts that have been talked about, not only in the virtual panels, but here today and last night, are all different kinds of contexts. Geographical contexts, for sure, and we can all remember the papers that talked about those, but also the context of different racial identities, of different statuses within racial identity, so that if we're talking about blacks in the American Revolution, we can't just talk about blacks in the American Revolution. We have to talk about free blacks in New England. We have to talk about enslaved people in the South. We have to talk about both men and women, so that the contexts in which we consider people have to be very specific. And I think that Lori Glover made the point of specificity in her presentation about how it's important to be very specific about how we're discussing things, which includes, as she pointed out, the different ages of Eliza Lucas Pinckney and her daughter, Harriet Pinckney Horry, who experienced the revolution in very different ways because of the difference in their own ages. So that's another context, is difference of age. I also think that I want to align myself to the comment that Serena made about the importance of Mary Sarah Bilder's insight about the age of constitutionalism, not the Constitution. It was something that was brought home to me when I was working on 1774, when I found the dialogue in the newspapers using the term unconstitutional, and people were asking, what does that mean? Because that was a new idea, the idea that anything could be unconstitutional. And what it meant was not opposite to any written constitution, because there were no written constitutions at that point in 1773 and 1774. It was somehow what is being done is opposite to the way we think the government should run. And that was used in one way by the British and eventual loyalists who said there shouldn't be committees and congresses that are operating outside of the context of regular assemblies. And then the other people, that is the revolutionaries, were saying, no, the British are doing things that are unconstitutional because they are adopting the coercive acts, and these are opposed to the way the government is supposed to operate. So these kinds of things, I think, show how much in flux ideas are that we tend to think of, or at least that turn up in textbooks, as somehow fixed. And one of the contexts that we have then in the revolution is to recover the kind of conceptual ambiguities that people were dealing with and thinking about, and make us think about them too. So I will stop there and turn it over to Alan.
Well, I want to start out by saying something nice about the bicentennial. I was very happily sitting in a bar watching the Boston Pops and the fireworks over Boston on July 4th, and so I have fond memories of it. But I also have fond memories because I went to graduate school shortly after that, and I was the beneficiary of a great surge of scholarship that was coming out, including Mary Beth's work. And I think we can sometimes forget just how much scholarship emerged and got some financial support initially from that bicentennial. And I suspect there'll be much less support financially coming from political entities for 2026. I also want to say that I've only been here today, but I've been quite struck by the numbers of ways, and this was particularly manifest in the last session about commemorations and classrooms, about how seriously everybody in this room is thinking about reaching out to a broader public and reaching out to students. And a consciousness that what we do as historians is not connecting all that well, but that we all want to connect better than we currently are doing. And I think what's really been valuable to me about being here and what Patrick and his staff has pulled off is inviting us all to come together and think about these questions, not just about what kind of scholarship we're going to do, but how that scholarship will be useful, relevant, will help at a particular moment in our republic, which is extremely fraught. And indeed, I think there are enormous dangers to our Republican institutions, and that we as historians ought to be doing whatever we can to contribute to a more positive development of where we're at as a nation right now.
Thanks to you both. So I have a couple more questions, one of which is maybe initially directed towards Mary Beth, and Alan will weigh in, and then the second one is maybe to continue a conversation that Alan and I have started in other ways. So, so first, I'd love for you to reflect a little bit, Mary Beth, on why or how it is that we understand now. It's clear. It's clear that we understand that we cannot tell the story of the American Revolution without thinking about and taking very seriously questions of race and racism. That doesn't seem to extend, I think, to our understanding of gender. We still, I think, tell stories of the American Revolution that don't take gender very seriously. And given that, Mary Beth, you've been working on this for so long, I wonder if you have any thoughts that you want to offer about why this would be, or how we might think differently.
Well, I talk through this. It's something that has interested me, not just in terms of gender and the American Revolution, but gender and history in general, which is that once people who had the insight of, oh my God, we have to talk about half the population, and once we start to do that, historians will start integrating the other half of the population into what's been a story of men. And it hasn't happened. And I remember, I harken back to when I was involved in starting women's studies at Cornell, and we very confidently, we the people who were arguing for the establishment of the Women's Studies program, we very confidently said to the Arts College faculty meeting, well, we expect the program to self-destruct in a while because everybody will integrate women into the general study of the society or the economy or whatever. And of course that hasn't happened. I mean, the Women's Studies program at Cornell is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year and shows no signs, it's changed its name, but it shows no signs of disappearing. And now, of course, there is interdisciplinary work, which is all kinds of reasons for it to continue. But I do think that too much the study of women has been segregated off into the side. Somehow it's a separate thing. It's not It's not a part of the overall story of the revolution or of American history. I mean, there's people who study women's history, and then there's people who study other history, which happens to be the history of men. It really hasn't worked the way we were hoping it would. This continues, and I don't know that I have a solution to it. I know that in 1774, although it's mostly about men, because it's men who are controlling the process, I did talk as much about women as I could, about specific women and what they were doing. For example, the sister of Abigail Adams, who devoted a great deal of attention to instructing their mutual nephew about why he shouldn't be a loyalist. But it's very hard to get this happening. And I actually, at one point, and there is a hint in the book, where I say that it could very well be that the way that let me back up. If we look at the opposition to the Townsend duties in 1767, 68, 69, into 1770, a lot of the push is for non-consumption. And so that automatically involved women, because they were the ones who were going to the stores. And so the men who were leading the the process against the Townsend Acts had to use women, had to involve women in what they were doing. And there are lots of essays in newspapers that a lot of people quote, including me, in Liberty's Daughters, about how women are really important. But in 1774, men grab control of the process. They make the process one of elected local committees, and those elected committees have to be involved with men and have to be exclusive to men. And so women get shut out of the process, because how are you going to stop the imports of tea or anything else? You stop it by coercing the merchants and not letting them buy it. So therefore, women can't have these things in the stores to purchase, and so women are written out of the process. And at one point, I kind of hint that this could be a masculine conspiracy to retrieve potential power from the hands of women. But I didn't do more than hint at it, because, of course, nobody said anything explicit. But women do get written out of the process of objecting to British policy, and it seems to be done very deliberately. And indeed, at one point, Samuel Adams, I quote him in the book, says, we can't trust the people not to buy tea, so we have to prevent the tea from landing in the first place. And that's basically what the Boston Tea Party is all about. So it's not just women who are written out of the process, it's ordinary men, too, are written out of the process. So I can have a kind of conspiratorial view of what's going on, a masculinist conspiracy, but women do get written out of the process. So, over you, Alan. See how do you respond?
It would be pretty foolish of me to try to add on to anything Mary Beth has said about something she has been the great leader in this field on.
Wow. Okay.
Would that people in 1774 reacted the same way? Anyway.
Okay. So I thought that merely as a way of starting to open the conversation to all of you, and also wherever it is I'm supposed to be waving at all of you online, might join in, I thought it would be important for us to dig in a little bit to this question about what is the relationship between the scholarly work that many of us do and the public-facing work that many of us do. And and I try to wear both those hats at once. It doesn't work that well, frankly. But I was, even reflecting on Alan's comment just now, how does the scholarship that we write, how will that be useful? And I think I'm curious about, how do we think about what is useful, and how do we know what is useful? How can we be sure about that? I think a little bit about the problems of thinking about civics, which were so well laid out, especially by Adrienne, who's here, not here, I don't see her, sorry, but was so brilliant. As she talked about, some of the work that that the museum is trying to do is it's asking people to think civically, is to think about how is it that they can contribute productively to their communities, right? How can they bring back this process of learning how to think, how to argue, how to disagree, and bring that back as part of the lessons of doing civics. But some of the other pieces that we've been thinking about as we think about civics have had to do with how do we tell the story of the founding of the United States, right? And what are the politics of those foundings? And then I think this is the place where Alan and I have been arguing about this for a little bit, right? How cracked are those foundations? How do we tell that story, right? When we start to talk about, is it possible to look at this complicated story of the founding of the United States and all of its complexity, and look at the present world in which we live now? How straight a line should we draw? How disheartened should we feel? How should we be offering hope to people? I think that was our first question. It's where we began last night here as we thought about the meanings of independence. And I think maybe that is a good place for us to continue to open this conversation. So Alan, do you want to start with that? And then Mary Beth.
Sure. So for the last 18 months, I haven't interacted much with other academics. But I've been on Zoom a lot with all sorts of different groups, and many of them that I would not have interacted with before. So it ranges from Merrill Lynch investment bankers to the patrons of the Liberty, Maine Public Library. And whatever I may present on there, I get questions that are often about taking down statues. Thomas Jefferson, do I like him? The 1619 Project, is this a great threat to our republic? And Howard Zinn's People's History, right? So I take away a couple of things from that. One is history matters a great deal beyond the academy. It matters a great deal. Second, they don't think about it in the ways we might like for them to think about it, right? And I don't want to just be dismissive of that. I want to, be reflective on that. Why is it that, they are coming from a particular place that, I might wish it was a different place they were coming from? And how can I be useful? And how can what I have to say be, somehow helpful to them? I do think that, and this was a couple of comments from the last session really resonated with me. Chiquita Smith said, everyone tells us what we should teach, right? So there's an assumption that if you can shape the next generation, that you can shape them through schools, and there are all of these mandates imposed on teachers to do this. So there's a conviction that while history doesn't get the attention that math does, that still history has this citizen formation responsibility that creates an enormous burden on teachers and works against what we might like them to do, which is to focus more on the inquiry. And then Ishmael Jimenez said that the national myth is unraveling. Well, it's unraveling in half of America. In the other half of America, they're doubling down on that myth. And I don't have a solution to that. I don't know that anybody has a solution to it, other than for us to try to engage with as many people as we possibly can to explain what it is that we do as historians and the relationship of that to the national myth.
Okay, well, I had a comment which has to do with the comment this morning that history is really an inquiry. It's not a set of facts, despite what the poll that the AHA was partly conducting said. And I don't know if this is a solution, but one possibility is to link another of the insights that I've gained from this conversation that we've had over the last week, including the virtual panels. We talked already about the broad context and how it's important to see people in a broad context, but I think it's also important to focus on the experience of specific individuals. And that one way that one can bring home to people today is by placing them in the context of someone in the past, by exposing them to not just the context in which that person finds themselves, but rather the conditions of that person's life and the specifics of that person's life. I mean, I go back to Laurie Glover's work on Eliza Lucas Pinckney, or Amy's work on, sorry, I can't speak your last name, Amy. Amy's work on Mary Willing Bird, and the kinds of constraints that are on both those women. And yet, while they're trying to deal with the situation, and their enslaved people are also involved desperately because of the impact of the revolution on those plantations. And I think stories like those, if they can be told to people today, can bring home to them the kinds of complexities that we've been talking about all week, and get away from the dreaded textbook, which I can say as a textbook author, get away from the dreaded textbook, which seems to present everything in concrete terms, that there's no ambiguity involved. So I think that looking at individuals struggling in situations can lead people today to say, okay, what would I do in that situation? I know when I used to teach the American Revolution, I would always ask the students by the end of the semester, think of your own political attitudes today, and would you have been a revolutionary in the 1770s, or would you have been a loyalist? And usually the students would respond that they would have been loyalists, because they tend to be conservative types. I was not teaching radicals at Cornell. So anyway, I do think that the sort of thing that indeed was being discussed about what you can do with a museum, or what you can do with scholarly work, to try to, or in classrooms, as I once did, by assigning students personas. I made up a whole bunch of slips of paper and I just handed them out. One person was a enslaved woman on a plantation in Virginia. One person was a Rhode Island merchant. One person was a this. One person was a that. And then they had to respond in that context to some event, the Stamp Act crisis, or the Declaration of Independence, or the Constitution, or whatever. And the students then had to go research that person and produce a short paper. It was only like 3 or 4 pages, but nevertheless present a position. And I think it really taught them something about that context, and maybe it taught them something about thinking about the context of their own lives.
So maybe I'll just try to pull those pieces together, and then we'll open it up if that's good. I think that, and this is so helpful for what you both said, that maybe one of the big shifts for us since 1976 is that historians have really come to understand that there is a relationship, an indelible relationship between the past and the present in which we live, right? Like, none of us can deny that anymore. And I think, Alan, your sense that we have to learn to think and live generously, right, with those people in our present. We have to think expansively about them. Some of those people with whom we don't always agree, right, or who wish stood with us differently.
Many of them are in my family.
Right.
Let's have that experience.
Some of them, right. Some of them we really live with. And that we connect with them, as Mary Beth pointed out, by thinking a little bit about what is our shared humanity, right? How is it that we connect as people in the present and in the past? But I think I just will offer for myself that, it's hard to think both at once between the present and the past, right? And yet that's the work that we are charged to do in this moment as people trying to make sense of the 18th century. So with that, I think we'll open it to questions.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Caroline Johnson from the APS, and I just want to first and foremost say that both of you are so accessible. Your tone is wonderful, it's really inviting, and I think earlier to a point that one panelist made that a goal is really to create historical empathy in order to create current day empathy. And to do that, as Serena was just saying, you have to relate on a human level or a basic level of humanity. So on a two-part question, to what extent is tone and access important in bridging this gap between the public and the scholarly field? And perhaps the second part to that, how do we challenge and complicate what people have learned about the past without necessarily condemning what they have learned thus far? So thanks.
I think tone is extremely important, and it's important to try to do as much listening as speaking, to try to understand where they're coming from and where their information comes from. Because if you just come across as you're telling them what to think, they're going to turn you off right away. And I do think that there are so many people on the other political divide that just expect that we don't listen to them, who want to cast us as elitists, that to just in the slightest way to try to present yourself as someone who is thinking about history, who's still figuring it out, that you haven't already figured it all out, because none of us, we know we haven't all figured it out. If you can come from that particular place to talk with people, then they're much more responsive, in my experience.
Yeah, I think Alan's had more experience with that sort of person than I have in the context of my recent, that is the context of the last 18 months. I too have not, just like all of us, I have not had interactions with students, I haven't had interactions with colleagues and so forth. I've had interactions on Zoom with book talks. And I think that the kinds of questions that I've gotten and the kinds of answers that I've tried to give have to do very much with trying to understand the context of that time, which I think can help people to understand the context of our time. It may be expecting too much, but the whole point, if I can go back to my book again, the whole point of my book is how uncertain things were in 1774. It was to try to show that people didn't know how the story was going to come out. It was to tell the story of 1774 as though no one knew how the story was going to come out, which they didn't. And some people who have reacted to my book have reacted to it badly, in the sense that they say, oh, this is the loyalist interpretation of the revolution, or this is not the story of the revolution that I'm familiar with. But that was my whole point. It was to try to recapture the uncertainty of the time. And I say at the end of the introduction that explicitly that Americans today think that people didn't argue about the revolution the way that we argue about politics today, but this is not true. We argued about the revolution in the same way we argue about politics today. And that's really the message that I want people to take away, and that would be the kind of message I would try to convey to people, or I have tried to convey to people as I've talked to people about what I've been doing lately.
Adriana, feel free to go with a voice from the internet if you want.
Turn things on. Okay, it's been a long day, all. So actually, Francine Stone is with us online, and this may be a question that Patrick will want to answer as well. So Francine asks, So with all of this astute advancement of our perspectives on the revolution here, so how will this all be offered publicly, both at the APS and in Boston in 2026? So all of these perspectives that we've been talking about, what's the plan?
Over to you, Patrick.
Who just waved his hand at us?
This is the first step of a 5-year road, but I think
The beginning of a 5-year plan. Yeah.
I think what Nancy Moses said in the last session was really instructive. There are a number of organizations that have formed, that are forming, that are getting more active. This is the first time I've gone through any commemoration like this myself. I'd love to hear what other people who've gone through this before. It seems kind of ill-formed at the moment, and in fact, what I'm most worried about, with Alan reference, is there doesn't seem to be a lot of big funding for it. In the same way that 1976, at least when I look at what happened in 1976, that took a lot of money to do what they did, and I just don't see that type of funding coming in. I don't see funding going to universities. There are certain professors that are bicentennial professors that were endowed as bicentennial. I don't see any of that initiative happening. So I just, we're having that. I don't know if there's going to be the external support to make this as large as it could be and have these conversations.
Well, let me just add, I think kind of the sensibility that we've been talking about in terms of the uncertainty that people were feeling in the historical moment, the diversity of people and their diversity of views. These are very well represented in Mary Beth's most recent book and also in Serena's most recent book. They kind of insert you as the reader into the lived experience without really knowing how the revolution is going to play out. In other words, they've freed themselves from teleology and plunge you into contingency. And that's why they're such exciting books. And I think that a lot of that is happening right now. I think the challenge is that non-academics who haven't read these books or are just coming at them in a more cursory way are still part of the teleology, right? They think that's how history has worked for the United States. And I pick up on a point that Bob Allison was saying in the last panel, that he takes reassurance from the fact that the past was a mess too. The fact that the United States began, and this goes to a Mark Peterson point too, it's an enormous diversity of polities that are trying to be cobbled together into a nation. And it's not a pretty process, and it doesn't play out in the way that the nationalist story tells us that it did. If it had, there wouldn't have been a civil war in the 1860s. But I do find that when you talk with people that the founding is really that way, it's not this ideal world that we have somehow digressed from. It's in fact people engaged in very, very difficult difficult politics about fundamental questions that we're still wrestling with today, that it's both very relevant to us, but also not this notion that we've somehow lapsed from them, which I think is an ongoing problem in our political discourse.
Yeah, I would agree completely, Alan, with what you just said. That, you weren't here before, but I don't remember who said it, but someone said contingency was one of the big words originally, and that's absolutely true. That to try to restore to people today a sense of the contingency of everything, and it's not sort of for the want of a nail kind of contingency. It is understanding that things could have gone in different directions, and the way things turned out is not necessarily the way that, shall I just say it, God inspired. So anyway, that's...
And if I could just say one thing, maybe a little more directly to the question, which is thinking about how will the stuff, that we've all been thinking about together, how will other people come to know it? Like, the point is not, I think, for us to offer it out in some way, right? But to think in the world, and I hate to say this in a room that's full of, museum professionals and others, but as we think about co-creation, right, with the people whom we hope will will want to also think about their relationship to this history. And I should add that at one point, we'd hoped that this panel would include Michael Witkin, who couldn't travel. But thinking about, his work about to come out, as we think really differently about what citizenship and inclusion could look like, the ways in which we've imagined in the past, of course, that indigenous exclusion was natural to the state, right? That, he's going to help us see that so differently. I've been thinking a little bit about a exhibit that's come out from the Smithsonian and several local state humanities councils called Why Treaties Matter, in which indigenous nations work together with the Smithsonian and others to talk about sovereignty, right? To talk about how is it that we want to talk about these politics, what matters to us. And so I think maybe also thinking together, all of us, as about co-creation could be productive.
Well, actually, Serena, stand up. I think that point actually speaks to what I've been thinking, which is that I think we all feel a tremendous burden of responsibility to, we want to be the difference makers. And I think there is a sense that, what I'm doing can be that difference-making act. And it's not a sort of a self-importance, but I think that we each feel the obligation to to move the ship around, as it were. And what we're doing does matter, but I think it's worth bearing in mind that it's very rare for a single work or single person to sort of have that thunderclap or that earthquake moment. If there's a metaphor, it's almost glacial. And, and I think the process is hugely important. And the one thing I've been thinking about, yes, the big funding sources aren't out there. And I too was a teenager in 1976 and remember it. And there are just so many more outlets out there, things like podcasts and, Zoom has made possible reaching out to new constituencies. And it may not be sufficient, but it seems to me that, in fact, the process of changing the narrative, it's a collective one, and it's going to be gradual. And it may well be that the results of what we're talking about now won't be felt by 2026. It may not be until 2037, but there's a gradualism here, and that's frustrating for us who would like to see it change like immediately. But I think that collaborative message, which you just ended with, is really, really important.
So we're running low on time, but I just want to make sure that I haven't missed anybody up in the balcony. I can run up there. Okay. Amy, let me run up. Adriana, do you have another virtual question to carry us over? No, you don't. Okay.
Mark has a question.
Oh, all right. It
follows directly on
okay. Here.
We spent too much time together.
Yeah, and I apologize for being the skunk at the garden party. And you may have heard more from me than you want to, but it follows from what Elijah was saying and the others. So Elijah talked about change. We've heard about talking about being helpful, hopeful. And these are all good things, but I'm not entirely clear on the direct object here. Hopeful to what? Helpful toward what? Change in what direction exactly? And the reason this concerns me is this. If we're, I may be on the end of the spectrum who thinks that the civic culture, the political culture, et cetera, of the United States is extremely broken and in danger of crumbling badly. And it makes me wonder then why looking to a revolutionary destruction of a long-standing empire that is done in horrifically violent ways and then creates a new set of states that then collectively create a new nation, each of which themselves offer majoritarian forms of politics, which necessarily means minority losers and all of those things, why this is the thing that's going to create cohesion, coherence, hopefulness, helpfulness moving forward. I am a bit confused on the relationship between what kind of event the American Revolution was and where people in this country or in this country's relationship to the larger world think that we should go in the future. My own hopes for any way out of the current American predicament is that we have to work really hard for peaceful kinds of solutions, right? And that to solve the kinds of constitutional, political, cultural problems that the United States is facing now, the answers won't be in violent insurrection, but in something much better than that. And so I do wonder what that helpful towards what, hopeful of what comes out of focusing on the American Revolution as the way to do this. That's my stunky question.
Well, I don't think it's a skunky question, but I think the revolution is more than its violence, even though its violence is, we can't work around it. We have to confront it. But it's also about political processes that end up being compromise, including the Constitutional Convention, very difficult compromises. And compromise has become a dirty word in politics, I would say with one party more than the other, but to a degree in both parties. And the pursuit of purism has become dominant in our politics, and it makes any kind of discourse almost impossible across these lines. What I have found from doing a lot of public speaking with audiences that are non-academic is that there are actually a lot of people who would just like to have a civil discourse in this country again, right? By people who disagree. My point is not that we should all be in agreement with each other, because that's impossible and I wouldn't like it. And I powerfully disagree with many of the people that I talk with, including within my family. But to just try to avoid fulfilling their stereotypes of who I am as a liberal is, I think, a very small contribution, but one that we can all do. And I don't think we're going to reach the utopia in this country that the values of this country would suggest that if we fulfilled them, we would reach that. I don't think we're going to get there, because we haven't gotten there in over 200 years. But I know we could get worse than we are now. And unless we do what we can to speak out for what we value, then I don't want to overplay our own influence either. But I do think that every one of us can do something as a citizen to contribute toward validating what we believe in and talking with other people. That's all.
So my question was, one of the themes that it seems like we've talked about a lot at this conference is a greater focus on the war itself. And one of the things that David Waldstreicher said earlier is that necessarily leads us to think about the economy. And some other people were commenting about how we focused on violence. But I do think one of the things I wanted to comment on about that is, this was a very violent society before the war. I think it's a different kind of violence, or it's a different kind of violence for white people. And I just wondered what you both thought about this renewed emphasis on the war itself, and how you think that will change the interpretations that we're looking at going forward.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. You answer first. I didn't catch all the questions.
So the question was about what do we make about the focus on the war itself and the nature of violence. I do think the revolution is dramatic in that before the revolution, there's lots of violence in colonial America, obviously. There's violence toward native peoples, there's violence toward enslaved people. Yeah. Violence is fundamental to the society, but white people had been largely, they didn't treat other white people like that. And the revolution breaks that down. And so to kind of understand the revolution, understanding why that would break down in the way that it did, I think is an important question. Now, we all wrestle with what's the most important question to explore in the revolution. I don't think there is one, the most. But I think that's an awfully important question and that's worth looking at. If I were just to throw it on the agenda, that what I think is perhaps understudied right now is religion in the American Revolution, and especially popular religion. Now, I've had the good fortune to read Brendan McConville's forthcoming book, and it's very eye-opening about what's going on out there in the countryside. And looking at religion can often get you toward common people in ways that some other venue would be less successful.
Well, let me make a comment about violence. I think that earlier today, Holger Hook's book on the Scars of Independence was mentioned, and excuse me, I thought I understood something about the violence of the revolution, but that book really brought home to me how violent things were that I hadn't, and especially the point that Alan just made, that is the violence of white people against other white people, and not just against Native people and enslaved people. I also have thought in the past about the long-term, going back to the David Wallstreicher point, about the long-term economic effects of the revolution, which were not great in many instances. I mean, people really suffered. Whole communities suffered, not just individuals like Eliza Lucas Pinckney. So I think there are all kinds of areas that are there to think about and to discuss and to research. But ultimately, one of the messages of the revolution is, I think, going back to something that Alan just said, is not only is there violence in the event, but then there is compromise in subsequent events, and political compromise eventually deals with things like, say, the Whiskey Rebellion and even Shays' Rebellion, so that there are possibilities for the political process to work, and those could be pursued today as well.
So we probably have time for, you want to take one final question? Serena, do you see anybody who's been?
Yeah, David has a hand up.
Okay.
I'm going to take a bit of a risk and offer a compromise position. It occurred to me, I don't know if Jack Rakov is still here, but Jack's still here. Good, because in the volume I referred to with the essay by David Armitage as Revolution as Civil War, Jack has an essay on constitutionalism as the happiest revolutionary outcome. And I read these two essays as these couldn't be more different. But the question really is, why is it that we think we have to choose between revolution as civil war and as violent, and the exciting new work by people like Holger Hook, which this theme or this aspect of the revolution was neglected for too long, and we're still, as scholars, trying to figure out the implications of the revolution being a civil war and being so violent, and the importance of American constitutionalism. Why do we feel we have to choose between those two things? Because I think it's a false choice. I know I'm interested in both. I think my goal would be to try to see how these two things are related and can both be true. And so I just hope that we don't have to necessarily say we're going with one narrative or the other. And the thing, insofar as it sometimes seems that the field has been polarized, it's because we sometimes box ourselves, each other, into positions where some of us represent one interpretation or the other. But I think that when we're in the classroom, we're actually trying to put it all together and make sense of it. And on my more charitable days, I can even see that in Jack's work, or for example, or in Gordon's work, for example. So I just think that I'm just hoping that there's a third way in that respect.
I believe in compromise.
To compromise? All right, Jack, I guess.
Jack wants to argue with David. I don't know, maybe more with Mary Beth. Look, when I teach the Constitution, and it's also in my book, Original Meanings, I ask which compromise mattered more. Yeah. the so-called great or misnamed Connecticut Compromise. I don't know if Alan will take this badly as a New Englander, or the 3/5 clause. And the two-part argument I want to make is, first off, the so-called great compromise is not a compromise. The basic vote there is 5-4 with one state divided. A large state, which should have, Massachusetts divided because Elbridge Gerry was a Nunnik and Caleb Strong voted with him. And the real compromise is actually the compromise over slavery. If you want to have a union that's going to include the South. And conversely, the compromise that actually most dogs American politics today, and it's replicated in the Electoral College, it's manifest in the Senate, and it's compounded by the filibuster, which I've actually written in various places, I actually think is normatively unconstitutional under expressio unio exclusio alterius rules. The compromise we ordinarily celebrate is, I think, the political disaster. The 3/5 clause is offensive to us for a variety of reasons, not always well understood by contemporary readers, because we see that as a kind of 19th century statement of African Americans are 0.6 the value of white Americans, and so on, which is a misrepresentation. So that's one of the things you have to wrestle with. I just add one more point to this. So long as I'm holding the mic, is that go back to something Mark said last night. Your Declaration of Independence is, it's kind of, in some ways, it's kind of a cursory text. We labor so much to interpret, really, the first paragraph and then make sense of the later clauses. The preferred meaning of the Declaration of Independence says it's informed by Americans ever since, I think, 1790, and arguably earlier, is the equality statement, which is, all men are created equal. So we read that in a liberal, individualistic way. That wasn't its original intended meaning from Jefferson's perspective. The point of the Declaration was not to offer a Rawlsian statement or a proto-Rawlsian statement of equality. It's essentially to say Americans as a people had a right, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just authority from the consent of the governed. It's essentially an argument about institutions and the collective identity of an American people. Now, we're going to have lots of arguments, have had already, and we'll definitely have them, about what is that collective identity. But the nature of consent is the problem, and I think about this every night, particularly in the wee hours when I'm not doing the spelling bee. I try to think, do I want to write a book about this or not? But I try to say this in my remarks the other day. Thinking about the nature of consent under our constitutional system at this moment in American history, where it's threatened by so many forces, both political, cultural, and constitutional. That's the most pressing problem I think the polity faces. And I think actually part of our agenda for 2026, both within the parameters of the David thing and the APS is to think about how do you focus issues on the nature of consent, because that Jeffersonian principles that bind the Declaration is what's coming most under pressure.
Think we don't need to compromise?
If I actually could just make one last point to bring those pieces together, right, from the comments about violence and those about compromise as we think about those conversations in the present day, right? And I think it's hard to think about violence in America at the moment without thinking about state violence and African descended people, right? It's sort of impossible. It's hard to think about the implications of compromise without, as Jack just pointed out, the questions about where those politics live with us today. So I think trying to sort out how do we explain this past, right, in a really difficult present in which we live is, that's the weight that sits on us. That I think Alan's right. We can't pretend it's not part of our obligation, and yet we can't do all the work alone.
I think we are. As we can see, we are unanimous in our appreciation for our moderator and panelists for a fantastic conclusion to this week. There's a lot of work ahead of us, but there's light refreshments now. So thanks so much for coming.